The Recreation Opportunity Spectrum, or ROS, is a planning tool used by the Forest Service and the BLM. There are variations, but both agencies use some version of them. The Park Service creates zones uniquely for each national park rather than trying to be universal across the country. What you'll get out of this is the concept that a lot of your planning can be done in advance. When you look at your land and you see how uses are already happening, and they tend to cluster together. So you're going to have uses near a road, and the farther from the road, you're going to have slightly different opportunities for recreation. So as much of this as you can delineate on a map, it can help you with your planning later when you come up to decisions that need to be made. The recreation opportunity spectrum is based on these characteristics. So remoteness, how close it is to a road or a city, the size of the area, the polygon that you're considering, evidence of humans is a big part of it, and the social setting, usually meaning are there lots of people or few people, and then management setting, which can be as broad as it's a national park or a national forest, and then what are the other plans that are already set up for the place. At one end of the spectrum is your urban, and certainly when we look at these criteria, remoteness, it's not at all remote. Small is the usual size of these. We're looking at public parks here. Evidence of humans is extensive. Our social setting is frequently crowded, lots of people. Management setting is highly managed. You'll even have lawns. And as you can see, things to play on for kids. I'm not going to read this to you, but so you can go to your books to get these details. But I do want you to know that a lot of this is already spelled out. So you can see that with infrastructure, we're looking at access, camping or picnic sites, what sanitation is developed, whether it has a water supply or not, how many signs are around for many things, including interpretation, and then how highly developed are things like water crossings, meaning safety. Rustic is another category. It's the next one heading away from urban and toward wilder places. So rustic, we can see remoteness, typically some. So around here, it's going to be in the Cottonwood Canyons, Mill Creek Canyon, and close to roadside. Most of these are fairly small along the edges of roads. So this is a picnic ground or a campground. Evidence of humans is obvious, but there's still some of nature left there. The social setting can be fairly crowded. Quite a few people are there, and the management setting is fairly highly managed. They're providing quite a few amenities. Again, quickly letting you know that we're speaking very quickly, but a lot of this is spelled out, which helps you later with your planning of what things are acceptable in a zone that has been designated rural. Concentrated isn't that different from rural. You can see, though, here we have major activities of a developed nature. So ski resorts on our national forests, parking lots for snowmobiling can be fairly concentrated. Let's see, remoteness. As you move away from the parking lots, you can get into some remote areas. Sizes now are quite a bit bigger generally than, say, a picnic or a campground. Evidence of humans, it's still designed for human recreation, often motorized recreation. The social setting is pretty busy. And then the management setting, some controls, some regulations, but not quite as heavy as, say, keeping people into their campgrounds and campsites. A similar term that's used in some areas is roaded natural at this stage. So mostly it's a natural environment. Mostly ski resorts look like what they used to be, although they have clear cuts now for skiing down. But yes, mechanization is allowed. There are roads, and yet the emphasis is on still being mostly a natural environment. Moving from roaded natural to more wild is semi-primitive motorized, which sounds like a funny term, but we're kind of stuck with it. So, because that's what we're describing. It is semi-primitive. It's almost primitive, but motors are allowed, and they're often allowed just specifically on a road. And in the forest, those roads are often old timber roads. Sometimes they are going somewhere else, but the emphasis again is this is pretty primitive, limited recreation. So on the semi-primitive motorized table here, what I want you to take a look at, because here's a term you need to know. Under infrastructure, access, fishing sites, camp and picnic sites, not developed, leave no trace, some identified, dispersed areas. So dispersed camping is the term that you need to know. This is a Forest Service term, BLM term. National parks don't allow it. But many parts of our forests and BLM land, you're allowed to camp almost anywhere, and you're allowed to drive your vehicle so many feet. They have to be defined by the local district. Usually it's under 200 feet off of a named and numbered road. So you do have to stay fairly close. They may block parts, like they might on the Mirror Lake Highway, block the river side of the road, but allow you to camp almost anywhere on the opposite side of the highway from the river. Semi-primitive, non-motorized, you're getting the picture here now. It's not all the way into like the wilderness designations, uh, but it's being managed right now as semi-primitive, so there can be things like dams and power lines, and yet it's still non-motorized. So take note up here where the theme for the semi-primitive non-motorized, predominantly natural appearing, rustic improvements to protect resources. So you won't see a lot of development, but a little bit. So primitive is the word that's partially blocked right there. This is at the far end of the spectrum. It's the opposite end of the urban. So these are the most remote places. These can be at least 5,000 acres or larger if they have the potential of being designated wilderness if they aren't already designated wilderness. Evidence of humans is very limited to things like trails. Social setting, usually solitude is the desirable, meeting for fewer other groups. Management setting is usually mostly hands off, but these are pretty tightly defined as non-motorized, very little development. So the theme here of remote, 3 miles from motorized use, that's an ideal. Certainly where wilderness areas get designated, very often they're now getting rid of that idea of a buffer zone, that you designate it right out to the edges. So the idea here, it isn't always designated wilderness, but it's being treated awfully close as if it were. And sometimes it is actually designated wilderness. This table is just to let you know, we're certainly not going to read it, but it's to let you know that there are quite a few definitions spelled out, practices spelled out. So a lot of decisions are already made once you draw the lines for the six levels in the opportunity spectrum. Arches National Park here. Now, again, I said the national parks don't use the recreation opportunity spectrum. Instead, they look at their parks and look at the uses that are there and make distinctions of what's allowed in these different zones. So Arches National Park, probably most of you have been there, very popular park. And looking down at the bottom left in the legend, you will see 3 different shades of gray: white, gray, and almost black. The front country is the darkest. That's the main road. So, and it's spur roads. And they're all paved. And that's unique to Arches because other parks are going to be different, which is why these zoning systems are different. And then the gray road is a high clearance road. Part of it is passenger car possible, the very top part of the gray. And then there's a wide gray area, which has a loop. And then the gray area coming down from that is high clearance vehicles. Even though you don't really need four-wheel drive, you do need the extra clearance. So that's got a different name. The first one was called Front Country Sightseeing, the darker. And then the gray is the backcountry motorized recreation. So again, a vehicle can go part of it. I mean, a passenger vehicle, and then you need high clearance for most of it. Uh, there's no camping out there. There are marked routes. There's no interpretation maybe in the parking lot. And then the white, which is most of the map, and, well, most of the inside of the boundary of the park, most of the map is BLM. Uh, Inside that white area is backcountry non-motorized recreation. So no roads are out there. It's foot and horse track pass, foot or horseback access only. Very few trails or marked routes, um, and there's no interpretation out in the backcountry. Uh, by this definition, I have found a few down in Canyonlands where they have put them out in their backcountry zones, a mile from the parking lot. So you do get a little bit of interpretation out there. So those are the three zones that Arches National Park has written in for themselves. Same map with a very different emphasis. You can still see the roads and imagine where the darker and the lighter grays are following the roads. But now we have these squares, and these squares are Utah state lands that are inside the park, which makes management a little bit awkward. More often than not, when parks are designated, the state and the federal government make land swaps to get the state lands out of the national park. So it surprises me to see that this park has state lands still within its boundaries. So what do we do with this tool, the recreation opportunity spectrum or the management zones for the national parks? Well, when we have a list, which is wrapped all around this same map, a list of projects that the Park Service would like to get done. And up there at the very top, so the Devil's Garden has a number of things that they want to expand, add to, but they will stay within their definitions. So that area can have more roads, it can have some interpretation, it can have new or different outhouses, it could have a different campground, uh, because it's the least restricted area. So looking around, following each one of these issues that they want to work on, if we spent the time and looked at each one of them, they would fit within the definitions of whichever zone they landed in. Now we're focused down to the details of the details. So right at the entrance, so we're still in the darkest of gray. We're right along the highway here. When they put in a new visitor center a little bit ago, uh, this was the design plan and the descriptions of the different things that are needed, and they will all fit within that zone and the description of the zone given in the earlier map. This place is kind of fun because that's the area near the entrance, which most of you have come through. You've probably stopped at that new visitor center. And then overlaying it is the plain. You can see that almost everything there is in a potential floodplain, which of course makes building and planning difficult. And if you recall being there, there isn't a lot of room there. There isn't a lot of room in a lot of parts of the park, but they want to keep all this building down by the highway as much as possible. So they end up building in a floodplain, and floods from flash floods from heavy rains is the potential. So taking these levels of planning, you've got your recreation opportunity spectrum or your zones, and those are very broad. Now we are looking at an area even smaller than the visitor center and the entrance area. Looking in the upper right of this slide, you can see the LaSalle Mountain overlook and a line pointing to where this little turnout is. and the design plans that they have for it. And all of these will fit into that heaviest use area. So provide hiking route to the Courthouse Canyon, and then that leaves that zone. So it goes out into the white, which is the backcountry. Uh, that's the top left. So below that is provide trailhead with orientation interpretation exhibit. So yes, they do allow those interpretation signs right in the gray zones. So restriping, following around counterclockwise, uh, making the viewpoint handicap wheelchair accessible, uh, changing the interpretation sign, adding a sign to identify limited sight distance, that's a traffic problem, and then add a sign to distinguish location of trailheads before you pull in and try to park. So little tiny details that still are regulated by the bigger, broader planning zones. We're going to move quickly through these drawings, renditions for future projects. Still in arches. This one is mainly adding accessible parking, accessible short trails. Let's see. We've now moved to the Devil's Garden Trailhead. This is the most popular place for people to head out. This is the trail to Landscape Arch. Maybe Delicate Arch is just as popular. And a little bit of the changing that they want to do here. So still all has to fit within the recreation opportunity spectrum for their front country designation. And here's an idea for the campground amphitheater, trying to expand it a little bit. It's a really cool amphitheater. I hope you get to go to a program there because the amphitheater is real amphitheater surrounded by fins and arches on the edge of the campground. So we're switching now to the National Forest. This is local, so we have Mill Creek, Big Cottonwood, Little Cottonwood, um, which is the end of the Salt Lake District. And the management prescriptions are down the left side there, starting there. The greens are existing wilderness. Below that are the yellows of a special management area. And those get striped. So if we switch over there to the yellow and the striped, then we have a roadless inventory with land that's potentially designatable as wilderness. It isn't currently, and that's why it's up there in a special management zone. The reds are watershed, so all of that area would be watershed because this is our watershed that Salt Lake drinks out of. It has special regulations mandated by the city and the state to the Forest Service. But so much of the area is already designated wilderness, the red doesn't show up all that much. The ski resorts in this case show up in gray, as does most of the private property. Not all the ski resorts in gray, because a lot of it still is Forest Service. Looking in those green zones, you can see that they are 1, but there's 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and this is the Forest Service saying that we're going to manage these zones within a zone a little bit differently. So the 1.1s, they're calling Opportunity Class 1 within existing wilderness class, Opportunity Class 2 for 2.2 or 1.2, 1.3 Opportunity Class 3. And there will be slightly different management prescriptions, particularly about opportunities for solitude as you get into those higher decimals. Still the Wasatch Cache National Forest, but now we're looking at the north slope of the Uinta Mountains. The south slope is Ashley National Forest. It's in white there, but that's a different forest, so this is not the forest map. And you can see the highest southern end of that all the way across is designated wilderness, and those darker striped greens are proposed wilderness additions. And then we get into other prescriptions. And the red lines are the riparian areas of the streams. So they have different prescriptions themselves. Mostly just letting you know it's both complicated and a lot of the decisions are already made. when these maps were drawn decades ago. Now the western end of the Uintas, mostly but not entirely North Slope, more of the Uinta Wasatch Cache National Forest, and there are the prescriptions. Uh, so the light green is currently designated wilderness. You can see that has decimals. I'm only seeing 1.2 and 1.3. Oh, there's a 1.1. Then the dark green that's got stripes is another, actually there are two of them, proposed additions for wilderness. The big one on the left is an interesting one. It's above the Mirror Lake Highway between the Provo River and the Weber River. Perhaps many of you have already backpacked into that area. It's an interesting one because it is a proposed wilderness. It's a potential wilderness, and they treat it like wilderness, so you won't be able to take a mountain bike in there. But what's unique is they do allow motorized over snow in there. And this is an in-between designation, and right now the Forest Service is quite happy to have an area that's truly treated like wilderness in the summer, but in the winter they do allow that one exception of over snow motorized travel. And then you can see there are just a whole bunch of other prescriptions that we're not going to go into right now. We will have a Forest Service person talk to us. Antelope Island is a state park now, so we're leaving federal agencies. The state parks in Utah aren't as heavily developed and managed. Most of them are heavily motorized. A majority of them are around reservoirs. Since the state owns the water, they also purchase the land around it and manage them as for recreation, motorized recreation on the water. But Antelope Island is one of the few that is much less focused on motorized. So, in fact, you're not even allowed to bring a boat to shore without getting a permit and a number of things. So I was on their planning team for access and then eventually for the general management plan. And we were going through the most painful process possible of looking at every little piece of road and every piece of trail and every piece of historic building and trying to make decisions about each one. And it was going to take us a lifetime to work it all out. So thinking about what the Forest Service and the BLM and the parks do, the national parks, I suggested this set of zoning. And I just went home after one of our meetings and bought their $2 map before I left, drew a bunch of polygons on it, and gave them those names on the right. So as often as not, we were making decisions based on a lot of the biology. So those slashed ones there are critical pronghorn habitat, critical mule deer habitat, critical bighorn habitat. So I used that to overlay these other, looks like 5 categories. And then drew polygons and said, roughly, this is what's going on in these places. So there's the open recreation, which allows anyone, upper left, the very northwest corner of the park, anyone can go anywhere. And then south of there have always been restrictions that you had to absolutely stay on the trails or absolutely stay on the few roads that are out there. They're mostly management roads. Nobody was allowed to drive on them except for the Park Service. But you could go out on horses and hiking and mountain bikes. But you had to stay right on those corridors. So open recreation, northeast corner, and then the 3-4 zones underneath that, I gave them these titles and they ran with them. So recreation corridors in wildlife habitat, recreation shore in wildlife habitat. That was to get so we could start landing our kayaks and sailboats on the shore and not be chased off. Restricted recreation entry by permit. Those pretty much match with some of the bison, mule deer, pronghorn, lambing issues. And then the very southern part of the island is that limited entry critical wildlife habitat. And that was just allowing the stressed out bison, especially their favorite places, without people chasing them around. So applying those principles, of recreation opportunity spectrum to a new location really simplified planning, and the state park adopted it. This is out of the access plan. Well, you can see it's 17 years old. They're starting to revise it. It'll be interesting to see how much survives. This is an exercise we would do in class. So you can pause this and run through it yourself if you would like. And just relisting there the 6 opportunity classes, then I would split you into groups, but you can certainly still do this on your own. It'll just help cement them. So cite 3 examples that you're familiar with for primitive, well, for each one of those. You won't hit it perfectly, but you'll get an idea. But yeah, coming up with places will help anchor these things. Cite 3 motivations or benefits that you get from going to each of these opportunity classes. See how similar or how different those are. And then think about how much time you spend in each one of these. And then I had people sum them and total them and put them up on the board. You can choose to do that if you would like. So go ahead and pause the video right here. If you want to, it'll help you anchor these concepts if you apply it to your own life. And then just a few more things to help anchor. Go ahead, pause it again. And if you don't have Manning's book, you won't be able to do these last 2. So again, pause it. Otherwise, this wraps up this session, and Recreation Opportunity Spectrum and its allied planning tools can really save you a lot of time, and helps you be consistent. When people come to you with an issue that they want to do, somebody wants to do some filming and bringing in all kinds of vehicles, you can look at your plan and say, you can't do it here, but you can do it over there in this motorized section. So it can be a very useful tool.